everyone. Today, me, Jemeromi, and my teammates, which consists of Jennifer, Sureka, and Dashini, will bring all of you to the adventure in the world of lipids. Next slide. So, what are the components that make up the world in lipids? The first one is the triglycerides, which is the long-term energy storage. Second one is phospholipids, which is the membrane components. Third one, the steroids, which is known as four-fused rings. And the last one, which is waxes, it is a type of lipid.
Now I am going to explain about what is lipid. Lipids are organic compounds that made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Unlike carbohydrates, the ratio of oxygen atoms to hydrogen atoms in a lipid molecule is much lower and have a more common physical property of being soluble in non-organic solvents such as chloroform, ether, or benzene. Fat, a well-known lipid, is used for both insulation and long-term storage for bioanimals, while plants use oil instead of fat for long-term energy storage. Next, physical properties of lipid. Lipids are insoluble in water and polar organic solvents. This is due to their hydrocarbon chain and have no tendency to form hydrogen bonds with water molecules. Next, densities of lipids are always less dense than water. In addition, lipids have high viscosity. Lastly, lipids are greasy to touch and leaves a permanent oily stains on paper. Next. Next, chemical properties of lipid. First, hydrolysis of triglyceride. This is a reverse process of esterification. In this reaction, triglycerols like ester can react with water to form carboxylic acid and alcohol. Second, saponification reaction. Saponification is a process that involves the conversion of fat, oil, and lipid into soap and alcohol by the reaction of aqueous alkali. Third is the hydrogenation process. In this reaction, carbon-carbon double bond in unsaturated fatty acids can be hydrogenated by reacting with hydrogen to produce saturated fatty acid. Lastly, halogenation process. In this reaction, unsaturated fatty acids can react with halogens by the addition of double bonds. Next.
Now I'm going to explain about triglycerides. Both fats and oils are known as triglycerides. Triglyceride used as a long-term energy storage compound in plants and animals. Now let's have a look on the formation of triglyceride. First, a triglyceride formed through a dehydration reaction or known as condensation. A triglyceride is an ester that is formed from the condensation of one molecule of glycerol and three molecules of fatty acids. Now I'm going to explain how is the dehydration reaction occurs. First, three molecules of the fatty acid will react with the hydroxyl group of glycerol during the dehydration reaction. This results in the formation of triglyceride. Here, the glycerol have a hydroxyl group, have three carbon atoms that have a hydroxyl group. These hydroxyl groups are polar. Meanwhile, fatty acids are one of the building unit of lipid. Fatty acid consists of long hydrocarbon chain with a carboxyl group at the end. This triglyceride can be hydrolysis or broken down into fatty acids and glycerol by hydrolysis reaction. Take notice that one water molecule removed for each fatty acid's addition to the glycerol. Triglyceride can occur in two forms, which is oil and fat. Oil is made up of unsaturated triglyceride and fat is made up of a saturated triglyceride. Next, let's have a look on characteristics or features of the triglyceride. First, triglycerides are non-polar because they have many carbon-hydrogen bonds, so they do not dissolve readily in polar solvent such as water. Here we have to take note that just now we saw that the glycerol have a hydroxyl group that are polar and can dissolve in water, but triglyceride cannot dissolve in water because it have many carbon hydrogen bonds. Hence, triglycerides are non-polar. Next, triglycerides are hydrophobic. Hence, they do not form any hydrogen bond with water molecule. Next, the last one is the triglyceride are less dense than water. When we put oil and water together, we can observe that the oil will separate from the water. This is because the water molecules bond together through hydrogen bond and exclude the oil. Hence, the triglyceride will float in water. Next, we will look on the fatty acids. There are two types of fatty acids. The first one is saturated fatty acids and the second one is unsaturated fatty acid. This saturated fatty acid will form a saturated triglyceride with glycerol. An unsaturated fatty acid will form an unsaturated triglyceride with glycerol. Saturated fatty acids have a hydrocarbon chain that contains only a single bond. We can observe the diagram over here. We can see that the hydrogen carbon chain contains only a single bond. Example of saturated fatty acids are steric fatty acids. Saturated acid have a single bond because all the bond between the carbon atoms have already have a maximum number of hydrogen atom. Meanwhile, for unsaturated fatty acid, the hydrocarbon chain contains one or more double bonds. We can observe in the diagram over here, we can see they are a double bond between the carbon atoms. Example for the unsaturated fatty acid is oleic acid. Hydrocarbon chain have one or more double bond because the carbon atoms are not bonded to the maximum number of hydrogen atoms. Now let's have a look on the characteristic of a saturated fatty acid and unsaturated fatty acids. First, the saturated fatty acid exists as a solid at room temperature, which is the fat. And meanwhile, the unsaturated fatty acid exists as a liquid at the room temperature, which is the oil. Saturated fatty acids have high melting point, meanwhile unsaturated fatty acid have lower melting point. Now let's look why is the melting point between these two fatty acids differs. First, for the saturated fatty acid, they are more dense and have no double bonds. This will cause the saturated fatty acid to have a higher melting point than unsaturated fatty acid. Meanwhile, for unsaturated fatty acid, the double bond creates a kink in the fatty acid chain. This prevents close packaging between the hydrocarbon chain. Hence, unsaturated fatty acid have low melting point. Now let's have a look on the examples of food that contains saturated fatty acid. First, we have meat, butter and milk chocolate. Here in the picture, we can observe there is also palm oil. Palm oil contains both saturated fat and unsaturated fatty acids. Since the palm oil contains saturated fatty acid, it is sometimes bad for the cardiovascular system. Next, for unsaturated fatty acids, we have vegetable oil like corn oil, plant oil, and omega-3 fatty acids. These omega-3 fatty acids are unsaturated fat in a fish. This acid gives benefit to health and reduce the risk of heart disease. Okay, now I'm going to explain about the importance of triglyceride. First, triglyceride stores metabolic energy as they have a higher calorific value than carbohydrates. This is because triglyceride have higher proportion of hydrogen and much less proportion of oxygen. Hence, when we consume food with moderate amount of fats such as meat, this will provide us energy to conduct our daily activity throughout the day. Next, fat acts as a energy storage in animal. For example, feet of the reindeer and penguin contain saturated triglycerides. This helps protect those exposed parts like feet from freezing. Next, the fat or blubber. Blubber means is a thick layer of adipose tissue under the skin of a penguin or walrus. This fat or blubber protects marine mammals from cold. And this blubber accounts for about 25% of the marine mammals' body weight. Okay, next in general, for the animals, they use fat as a long-term energy storage preference to the glycogen because the fat store more energy than glycogen. The carbon-hydrogen bond of fatty acid make them a richer source of chemical energy than glycogen. Other than that, we have another example. Small birds like the broad-tailed hummingbird store a great deal of fat before they start their long spring and fall migration flights. Lastly, the oil act as a energy storage in plants. Fruits and seeds are commonly often rich in oil. For example, avocado and olive oil. Lastly, let's have a look on the effects of excessive triglycerides in body. First, saturated fat as animal fat can raise the cholesterol in blood level. High animal fat can lead to circulatory disorder such as high blood pressure, coronary heart disease, and stroke. Hence, we have to replace the intake of animal fat with oils such as peanut oil and sunflower oil. Next, excessive triglycerides in body can cause arteriosclerosis. Arteriosclerosis refers to thickening, hardening, and loss of elasticity of artery walls. This process will restrict the blood flow and lead to atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is caused by the buildup of fatty plaques and cholesterol. Eventually, it will cause the coronary artery diseases. Lastly, extremely high triglycerides in our body can cause pancreatitis, which is acute inflammation in the pancreas. That's all from me. Next, my friend will explain about phospholipids.
Hello everyone. So now I will explain about what is phospholipid. So the bulk of the plasma membrane that surrounds the cell consists of a phospholipid bilayer, as we can see in the picture lah. So phospholipids in Greek word, phos means light, while the lipos means fat. These phospholipids molecules consist of two parts, where a polar head that gives hydrophilic properties, which means by attracted to water, and a pair of non-polar fatty acid tails that give it a hydrophobic properties, which also means by repel by water. Next slide. So our body cells usually have a watery intracellular environment and extracellular environment. This actually causes the phospholipid molecules to arrange themselves to form a two-layer membrane, which is called bilayer, in which the hydrophilic heads projected outwards, where the polar hydrophilic heads of the outer layer are in contact with the extracellular environment, while the hydrophilic heads of the inner layer points towards the intracytoplasm. They are attracted to water and forms hydrogen bonds with the molecules. As for the non-polar hydrophobic tails of the phospholipid molecules of both layers points towards each other and therefore will form an hydrophobic interaction with one another. They play an important role in the function of the plasma membrane as a selective barrier. Next slide. A plasma membrane is absolutely essential, and it is the main component of the cell surface membrane and membranes of organelles. And this actually signifies that the importance of phospholipids to living things are. Besides, the membrane also protects and supports the cell and controls everything that enters and leaves it. It only allows only certain substances to pass through while keeping others in or out. Next slide. Phospholipid, as implied by their name, they contain a phosphate group. A phospholipid molecule is formed from condensation of one glycerol molecule with two hydrocarbon fatty acid chains. Essentially, a phospholipid is constructed like a fat, except that in place of the third fatty acid attracted to glycerol, there is a polar phosphate group, like as I mentioned just now. The phosphate group is usually bonded to the third hydroxyl group of glycerol, which is another organic group, as we can see it here, 1, 2, 3. Next slide. So basically, there are two chemical groups they may modify the phosphate, which is choline and serine. Both choline and serine will attach to the phosphate group at the position labeled R via the hydroxyl group. In this example is the choline group that attached to it. As we can see from the picture, the portion of the molecules become polar head, while the hydrocarbon change of the fatty acid become the non-polar tails. Next slide.
So now I will talk about steroids. Next slide. Steroid is a complex organic compound with 4 carbon rings interconnected to form the main skeleton and the side chains of variable lengths. Different types of steroids differ by the types of functional groups that are attached to the carbon skeleton. In other words, the differences in the side chain give rise to different types of steroids. Steroids are normally can be found in both animals and plants. Next slide. The first example of steroid is cholesterol. Cholesterol is an important component of cell membranes. Cholesterol makes the bilayer of the cell membrane stronger, more flexible, and less permeable to water-soluble substances such as ions. Besides that, cholesterol is also the precursor of all other steroids, such as sex hormone. A large portion of cholesterol is obtained from diet, and the rest is synthesized by liver. Cholesterol is circulated to the whole body through blood, so the deposits of cholesterol on the arterial walls can cause the blockage of arteries. The blockage of arteries may cause heart attacks. Therefore, we cannot consume too much food that are high in cholesterol. The cholesterol level in human body is regulated by the liver. Excess cholesterol will be deposited as the gallstone in the gallbladder and also the bile duct. Next slide. Besides cholesterol, sex hormones such as testosterone and estrogen are also the examples of steroids. Testosterone is a male sex hormone and it is produced in the testes. Estrogen is a female sex hormone and it is formed in the ovaries. They differ by the functional groups that are attached to the same carbon atom skeleton. Sex hormones are very important for the skeletal growth and also for the maintenance of both the female and male skeleton. Next slide. In summary, there are many types of steroids that play major roles in the functioning of our body. Cholesterol is very important as it reduces the fluidity of the cell membranes. It is also the precursor of all other steroids. Next, bile acids help in the emulsification and digestion of fats in the intestines of our body. Testosterone also plays an important role in regulating the reproductive activities in male. Next, estrogen and progesterone can regulate menstrual cycle and pregnancy in females. Lastly, the adrenocortical hormones can control the stress responses in our body. Next slide.
Next, we look at anabolic steroids. Anabolic steroids, also known more probably as anabolic androgenic steroids (AAS), Anabolic steroids are synthetic substances that made up of testosterone. Besides, anabolic steroids can enter into the nucleus of the cell and increase the rate of transcription of genes which encode actin and myosin proteins, the main components of muscles. Usually, small sportsmen and women illegally take anabolic steroids to build up their muscles and enabling them to undergo strenuous trainings. Next, side effects of anabolic steroids. Anabolic steroids are banned, and anabolic steroids misuse might lead to serious and permanent health problems such as kidney problems or failure, liver damage, enlarged heart, high blood pressure, and changes in blood cholesterol, all of which increase the risk of stroke and heart attack even even in young people. Lastly, increase the risk of blood clots.
Next, I will talk about wax. Next slide. Wax is a type of long-chain non-polar lipid. It is the ester of fatty acids and long-chain alcohols. These long chains can cause the waxes to be waterproof. Waxes can be found on the cuticles of epidermis of leaf, fruits, or seeds of some plants. It can help to reduce the water loss through transpiration. Next slide. There are some common properties of waxes. Firstly, waxes are solid at normal temperature. This is because they have high melting points. Besides that, waxes are hydrophobic and resistant to degradation. Waxes are insoluble in water, but they can soluble in organic non-polar solvents. Next slide. In humans, wax is produced by the glands in the outer ear canal. Earwax contains cerumen that repels insects and sometimes even kills them. Other than that, earwax can trap dust and dirt, preventing them from reaching our eardrum. Apart from human, a honeybee will produce bee wax in glands on the underside of their abdomen. The wax is very important since it is used to make the six-sided cells where honey is stored. Next slide.
So now I will sum up what have we learned in the adventure just now by showing some importance of lipid. Next slide. Here are a few examples of lipid functions. Lipids play an important role in storing energy to reduce body weight and to make locomotion easier. If an animal eats an excessive amount of energy, it is able to store the energy for later use in the fat molecules, while in plant structures, it's involved in dispersal, such as seeds. Besides that, fats are a common and well-known form of lipids. They are made by bonding fatty acids to an alcohol. Fats can be stored around delicate internal organs, for example, to protect the kidney. Fats are also important for heat insulation. Marine mammals such as seals, dolphins, and whales offer a perfect example of how fats can provide insulation, as Sureka explained just now. In order to prevent themselves from freezing to death in water, many of these marine mammals actually have a thick layer of fat, which is called blubber, to keep them warm. Next slide. Next is steroids. Steroids are produced naturally in the body. Examples include cholesterol and the sex hormones, which is testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen, which is explained by Jennifer just now. Steroid hormones help to coordinate body activities. These cholesterols are important components of cell membranes. It actually helps to maintain the fluidity of cell membranes. It is also a precursor of vitamin D, bile acids, and steroid hormones. Lastly, waxes can form a protective layer in which the waxy cuticle covering on the epidermis of plant. It helps to reduce transpiration and the entry of pathogens. Next. I think that's all from us. I hope you all learned something from this, and do comment some thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you.